Welcome back to Inside the Philippines. Most of the stories we tell on this channel follow a familiar shape. Man gets lonely. Man finds the Philippines. Man loses money, dignity, sometimes both. Man goes home. We've heard a lot of those stories, and we'll hear more because they keep happening, and the lessons in them are worth repeating. But every so often, somebody sends us something different. Not a disaster. Not a scam unraveling. Something quieter than that, and in some ways harder to talk about. Because it requires a man to sit down in front of a camera and admit that the thing nearly went wrong wasn't because of her. It was because of him. Today's story comes from Ciarán Molloy. He's 55 years old, from County Leitrim in the west of Ireland, and he spent the better part of 30 years working underground as a coal miner. He's not the sort of man you'd expect to find on a channel like this. No beach bar ambitions. No 23-year-old girlfriend. Just a quiet man trying to figure out what his life looks like now that the work is done, and the house has gone very large and very silent. He went to Cebu in the spring of 2023, and he met someone. And what followed, what he nearly did, and what he had to unlearn before it was too late, is one of the most honest things anyone has sat down and told us. Here's his story, in his own words. I wasn't looking for a woman. I want to be clear about that from the start, because I know how this sounds, an Irishman of 55 talking about the Philippines. I know the image that creates, and it's not, it wasn't that, or it wasn't only that, or I didn't think it was that at the time. Right. I'll start at the beginning. I worked the Arigna mines first. That's in Roscommon, if you don't know it. The last coalfield in Ireland, and not a glamorous one even by coalfield standards. Cold, wet, narrow seams. You came up at the end of a shift, and the light hurt your eyes for the first 10 minutes no matter how many years you'd been doing it. I started there at 19 because that's what men from that part of Leitrim did, or what they'd done for 3 generations anyway. My father worked Arigna. His father before that. When they closed, and they did close, everything closes eventually, I went north. Tyrone. Different operation, similar work. You adapt. That's the thing about underground work that people on the outside don't quite understand. It's not just a job, it's a particular way of being in your own body. Quiet. Patient. You learn to move carefully in confined spaces. You learn that panic is a luxury you can't afford. You learn that the man beside you doesn't need to say much for you to know exactly where you stand with him. 30 years of that. Then one day, there's no more of it. And you're 52 with a pension and a body that's held up better than it had any right to. And you genuinely don't know what to do with yourself in the open air. The house is in Carrick-on-Shannon. Semi-detached, back garden, spare bedroom that's had the same curtains in it since 2008. I bought it with my wife. Well, my ex-wife, though she'd moved on long before we sorted the paperwork. No bitterness there. That's not what this is. She made the sensible choice. We'd grown into different people, and she had the good sense to notice before I did. The children are gone. That's the plain fact of it. Ciarán's in Brisbane, Donald's in Calgary, and my daughter Aine is in Melbourne. They left in their 20s, which is what young Irish people do, which is what I'd have done myself if there'd been anywhere obvious to go. I don't blame them. I'd find it much easier if I blamed them, but I don't. They ring sometimes. Voice notes on WhatsApp, mostly. I play them twice, always twice, I don't know why, and then I save them. I don't respond straight away because I can never work out what to say, and then too much time passes, and it feels strange to reply to a voice note from 3 weeks ago. So I don't. And then another one comes, and I play it twice, and save it, and the same thing happens again. I have 4 grandchildren I've met once each. The house is very quiet. That's the most accurate way I can put it. Not peaceful quiet. The other kind. I started watching YouTube the way you watch YouTube at 62 at night, when you've had your tea and there's nothing in particular on. One video leads to another. You know how it goes. Retirement videos, cost of living videos, men my age explaining how far a pension stretches in Southeast Asia. And I watched a few of these and thought, right, that's not for me. That's for a certain kind of man, and I'm not that man. But I kept watching, and after a while, the thought that wasn't for me became the thought, well, why not look into it? And the country that kept coming up, the one that kept getting mentioned for being English-speaking, Catholic, warm, relatively affordable, was the Philippines, Cebu specifically, or Dumaguete, somewhere in the Visayas. I am not impulsive. 30 years underground will do that to you. I spent 2 months watching videos, reading forums, downloading cost of living spreadsheets onto my laptop, and going through them with a pen. I wasn't booking a holiday. I was doing reconnaissance. There's a difference. My pension from the Irish state comes in at about €1,050 a month. I'd saved €60,000 over the working years. Careful money, nothing exciting, just money that never got spent on anything better. The question I was trying to answer was whether a man could live decently in Cebu on that income without burning through his savings. The answer, as far as I could tell, was yes, possibly very decently, compared to what a wet winter in Leitrim offers. I booked 3 weeks in April 2023. Told my neighbor Mossy about the plants. He has a key. Told nobody else, because I didn't want to explain it, and I wasn't sure I could. My daughter rang while I was packing, and I nearly told her. But then I thought I'd wait until I had something worth saying. I'd only be gone 3 weeks. If it came to nothing, I didn't need to have had a whole conversation about it beforehand. I flew Dublin to Dubai to Cebu. 22 hours, more or less, which is a long time to sit with your own thoughts. I thought about the house. I thought about Mossy's phone number being on the counter in case of emergency. I thought about whether I was being completely stupid. Probably a bit stupid. Not completely. The Philippines can wait one more chapter to explain itself, because I want to say one thing first, about that flight. Somewhere over the Gulf. 4 in the morning, dark outside, everyone else asleep. I admitted something to myself that I'd been careful not to say out loud or even think too directly. I wasn't only going to look at property prices. I was going because the house was quiet, and I wanted it to be less quiet. I didn't have a plan beyond that. I want to be clear, I didn't have a plan. But that was the true thing, and I'd spent enough time underground to know that you don't ignore true things. You just have to know what to do with them, and at that point, I didn't. I landed in Mactan in the early afternoon. The heat met me at the door of the plane like something physical. Not unpleasant, just immediate, unmistakable. The kind of heat that tells you clearly that you are somewhere else now. Right then. Here we go. The guest house was called Villa Remedios, which I thought was a good name for a place. It was on a side street off Gorordo Avenue in Lahug. 3 stories, a small electric gate, a ceiling fan in every room that wobbled slightly but did the job. I'd picked it because 2 different forums said it was clean and quiet, and the owner spoke clear English. Both things were true. The owner was a compact, efficient woman named Mrs. Ocampo, who showed me the room, showed me where the hot water switch was, and told me breakfast was served until 9. She did not try to have a conversation with me, which I appreciated enormously. The room cost 1,200 pesos a night. About 20 euros, give or take. Less than I'd been paying to heat the house in Carrick. I lay on the bed for 20 minutes after she left, looking at the ceiling fan going around, and felt the particular strangeness of being somewhere completely new at 55. Not bad strangeness, just the strangeness of having stepped outside your own outline for the first time in a long while. The first 3 days I did exactly what I'd said I was going to do. I walked. I had a notebook, actual paper, spiral-bound, and I wrote things down. Prices at the market near Lahug. The cost of a San Miguel at a corner store versus a restaurant. What a tricycle ride cost from Gorordo to Ayala Center Cebu. I ate at a carinderia on the first morning, pointed at 2 things behind the glass without knowing what they were, paid 85 pesos, about €1.40, and ate whatever they turned out to be sitting on a plastic stool on the pavement. Pork something. Rice. It was good. The heat was, well, it was something. It wasn't unmanageable, but it required adjustment. By midday I'd worked out that the correct approach was to find somewhere with air conditioning and sit in it for an hour, which the Philippines accommodates readily because there are Jollibees and SM malls and coffee shops everywhere you look, all of them aggressively cold inside. I started to understand why people gathered in malls here the way people back home gathered in pubs. It wasn't consumerism, it was temperature regulation. On the second day, I went to look at a condominium development near IT Park. A newish building, the kind with a swimming pool on the roof that's always in the photographs. The salesman was very young and very enthusiastic and explained the foreign ownership rules to me carefully, which I'd already read about, but let him explain anyway because he was doing his job properly. Foreigners can own a condo unit, he said, but the building has to be less than 40% foreign-owned. He showed me a one-bedroom unit at 3.8 million pesos, roughly 63,000 euros. I took the brochure and thanked him. The number wasn't impossible, but it was most of my savings, and I'd need to think about it for more than an afternoon. I thought about it and decided not to think about it further until I'd been there longer. What I noticed, and I kept noticing it day after day, was how people spoke to me. Not in a transaction, not because they wanted something, just strangers. The woman at the carinderia asked where I was from on my 3rd visit, and when I said Ireland, she said her cousin had tried to go to Ireland for nursing work, and asked, was it very cold? We talked for a few minutes. She didn't ask what I was doing in Cebu, or whether I was married, or what I earned. She asked about the weather in Ireland, and told me her cousin had eventually gone to Dubai instead. A small thing. But in Carrick-on-Shannon I could go 3 days without a conversation that wasn't a transaction. So I noticed it. Day 5, Mrs. Ocampo mentioned a restaurant about 10 minutes walk away when I asked where she'd recommend for local food. Somewhere her husband's family knew, she said. Good sinigang. She wrote the name on a piece of paper in handwriting I couldn't read, but the map on my phone found it anyway. It was the kind of place that doesn't need a sign you can read from the street. If you know it, you know it. And if you don't, someone will have pointed you there. Plastic chairs, 4 or 5 tables. A fan on a stand in the corner that oscillated hopefully without making a decisive impact on the temperature. There was a chalkboard menu and a smell of garlic, and something sour and good coming from the back. I sat down and ordered the sinigang, which arrived with rice in a clay pot, and was everything Mrs. Ocampo had promised. Pork, tamarind broth, vegetables. I ate slowly because I had nowhere to be. There was a woman at the table beside me. She was on her own, eating rice and something in a small bowl, and she was frowning at her phone in the focused, dissatisfied way of someone doing arithmetic that has stopped cooperating. She had reading glasses pushed up on her forehead that she kept pulling down and pushing up again. After a few minutes, she looked over at me, not with any particular expression, and said, "Excuse me, do you know anything about spreadsheets?" I said I didn't. No. She nodded as if this was the expected answer and looked back at her phone. Then, and I'm still not entirely sure why, I said, "What's the problem with it?" She told me. It was something to do with a formula that wasn't pulling numbers correctly from another tab. I understood about 40% of what she was describing. I told her honestly that I didn't think I could help, but that I was happy to look if she wanted a second pair of eyes, and she handed me the phone with the manner of someone who had run out of other options. I looked at it for a moment, confirmed that I could not help, and handed it back. "Right," she said. "Thanks anyway." "Sorry." "No, it's fine. It's my fault. I'll fix it later." She didn't go back to her phone immediately. She looked at me with the slight assessment of someone deciding whether a conversation is worth the energy, and then she said, "You're not American." "Irish," I said. "Ah," she nodded. "Long way." Her name was Annalou. She was the bookkeeper for this restaurant, which was run by her cousin Rodel, whose family had owned the building for 30 years. She did the accounts 3 times a week, usually at lunch, because the kitchen was too noisy and the office was a cupboard. She said all of this plainly, the way you describe a practical arrangement, not the way you describe your life to a stranger you are trying to impress. We talked for, I think it was about 40 minutes. She asked whether I'd found the city confusing. I said the traffic specifically was confusing in a way I found almost admirable, as if there were rules I simply hadn't been given access to. She said there weren't really rules. I said that explained a lot. She asked if the heat was manageable. I said I was still arriving at an opinion on the heat. She did not ask what I did for work, or what I was doing in the Philippines, or whether I was married, or whether I had a girlfriend, or what I earned, or how long I was staying. These questions would have been the obvious questions. She didn't ask any of them. She finished her meal. She paid for it herself. Flagged Rodel, who came out from the kitchen wiping his hands on a cloth, and paid him directly, said she'd have another look at the formula tonight. Rodel said not to worry about it. She said she would worry about it because it was wrong. She said, "Nice to meet you," to me. I said likewise. She left. I sat there for another 10 minutes finishing my sinigang, and I thought about the conversation in the way you turn something small over in your hand just to feel the weight of it. She hadn't asked me anything about money. That was the thing I kept coming back to on the walk home along Gorordo in the late afternoon heat, past the sari-sari stores and the basketball court where 6 teenagers were playing in the full sun without apparent difficulty. She hadn't asked me a single question that was really about what I could provide. She'd asked me about the traffic and the heat. I thought I'd probably go back to that restaurant. I did, 3 more times before the week was out. The second week started with no particular plan. I went back to Rodel's restaurant on the Monday because the sinigang had been good, and there was no other reason needed. Annalou was there. We talked again. Same table, same fan oscillating in the corner, same smell of garlic from the back. 40 minutes, maybe. Then she went back to work, and I went back to walking around Lahug with my notebook. Tuesday, she wasn't there. I ate alone, which was fine. I'd been eating alone for 3 years. Wednesday, she was there. We talked for longer. I want to be clear about what this was at this stage, because I've thought about it a fair bit since. It wasn't courtship. It wasn't strategy on either of our parts. It was just 2 people who happened to be in the same place at the same time and found conversation easy. She told me about the accounts work, the particular frustrations of small family businesses where everyone's related and nobody wants to hear that the numbers don't balance. I told her about Arigna, about what it had been like when they closed. She listened properly, the way people do when they're genuinely interested, rather than just waiting for their turn. I met Rodel properly that Wednesday. He came out to say hello. He'd seen me a few times now, and he was the kind of man who takes an immediate, uncomplicated interest in everyone. Big handshake, big smile, questions about Ireland delivered with the enthusiasm of someone who's never been, but has a general impression that it involves a lot of green and Guinness. He wasn't wrong on either count, I told him. He thought this was very funny. Rodel's wife and their 2 kids came in for lunch on the Thursday. His wife's sister and her husband too. 6 of them around a table, the children eating without looking at their food because they were watching a video on someone's phone. The adults all talking over each other with the specific volume of Filipino family conversation, which is considerable. It was chaotic and warm, and it filled the room completely. And here's the thing I'm not proud of, and the thing I want you to understand, because it's the first of 3 mistakes, and it's the one that's most embarrassing to explain. I paid for their lunch. All 6 of them. Nobody asked me to, nobody suggested it. Rodel moved to pay, and I said, no, please, I'll get this, and I insisted. The bill came to 2,100 pesos, about 35 euros. Nothing. Practically nothing. And I paid it with the internal feeling of a man who has done something right and useful and kind. I wasn't trying to buy anything. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't calculating. It was reflex. Back home, that's what you did. Someone showed you hospitality. You reciprocated materially. A man in Leitrim shows he cares by paying for the round, fixing the fence, carrying the thing that needs carrying. You were useful. That was the vocabulary I had. What I didn't notice, and I think about this a fair bit now, was the slight pause before Rodel said thank you. Not a long pause, a small one. And Annalou, who was sitting at the end of the table with her accounts book, didn't say anything at all. Just looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't read, and then looked back at her work. I noticed it, and I didn't understand it, so I filed it away and forgot it. 2 days later, Annalou mentioned in passing that Miguel, her son, was starting a new school year in June, and that the required textbook list had come home, and it was longer than she'd budgeted for. She said this the way you mention weather, just a fact about what's currently happening in your life. She wasn't looking at me when she said it. She was looking at her coffee. I said immediately, without hesitation, I can help with that if you need it. Happy to. The silence that followed was not the silence I expected. She looked at me, not with gratitude, with something more careful than that, and slightly cooler. That's very kind, she said. But I'll sort it. I said, of course. No problem, just offering. And I thought that was the end of it. A couple of days later, this was near the end of my 2nd week, I was already thinking about flights home and whether I might come back in the summer. She asked if we could have coffee, just the 2 of us, not at Rodel's. We walked up to a place on Salinas Drive, one of those coffee shops with wooden furniture and Tagalog pop playing at a volume that allowed conversation. She had hers black. I had mine with too much milk because I always do. She said, quite directly and not unkindly, Ciarán, I want to say something, and I hope it's okay. I said, of course. I didn't ask for help with the textbooks, she said. And Rodel's family, they didn't need you to pay for lunch. I said I knew that. I was just being generous. She was quiet for a moment. I know, she said. I can see that. But when someone offers help before you've asked for it, it can feel like they've already decided what you are to them. Does that make sense? It didn't, quite. I said so. She thought about how to explain it. Some men come here, she said carefully, and they see a problem to be solved, with money. And I'm not a problem, Ciarán. I said I knew she wasn't a problem. I know you know, she said. I just wanted to say it. And here's the thing. Even then, even sitting there with her being as clear as she could possibly be, I still didn't fully understand what she was telling me. I heard the words. I thought I understood them. I said I did. I said I was sorry if I'd made her uncomfortable, that it wasn't my intention, that that's how I was, I suppose. She nodded. We finished our coffee. It was fine. But the thing she was actually saying, the thing underneath the words that I genuinely did not have the equipment to hear at the time, was this. I don't want to be the recipient of your generosity before I'm even your friend. Because if you lead with money, I can never know which one you actually want. I understand that now. I didn't then. I went home to Ireland with Annaloo's number in my phone and the genuine intention of coming back. I'd booked nothing yet, but the intention was there. I'd had 3 weeks that felt more alive than the previous 3 years, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise, not to myself at least. But there was already something slightly careful in how she said goodbye. Warm, but measured. The same way you leave a door open but don't prop it. I told myself it was just that she was reserved. It was her manner. She was like that with everyone. She wasn't like that with everyone. She was like that with me. I just didn't know why yet. Back in Carrick-on-Shannon in early May, the house received me the way it always did. The particular smell of a place that's been closed up, slightly stale. The heating having clicked on and off all week for nobody. I put the kettle on. I looked out the back window at the garden, which needed doing. I thought about Cebu. The messaging started almost immediately, which surprised me. I'd half expected a polite fade. The kind of thing that happens when a holiday ends and the people you met in it go back to being strangers again. But Annaloo messaged on the second day, after I got home. Just a short one. Asked if I'd landed safely. I said I had. She said good. And that became the thing we did. Messages, a few times a week. Not long ones. She'd say something about the accounts work, about Miguel, about nothing in particular. I'd respond. I was, as I say, not a gifted communicator in text. My messages were short and factual. Hers were longer, warmer, with the occasional observation that made me smile at my phone sitting in the kitchen in Carrick-on-Shannon. I thought things were going well. Nothing had gone wrong. That was my metric. We did 2 video calls over the summer. WhatsApp. Both of them slightly awkward in the way video calls are when you're not quite sure of the register yet. Too formal. Too aware of your own face on the screen. I sat in the kitchen both times, and she sat in what looked like a small room, a bookshelf behind her. We talked about ordinary things. She asked if I was eating well. I said well enough. She laughed at something I said, though I can't now remember what. I thought, after the second call, that this was going fine. But I was also, during those 4 months, doing something I'm not particularly proud of. I was reading the YouTube comments, not just watching the videos, reading the comments underneath. You know the ones. Older Western man in Southeast Asia, girlfriend half his age, keyboard philosophers lining up to explain what's really going on. I read those comments about other men, and I thought about how they applied to me. The thing is, they didn't quite apply to me. Annaloo wasn't 23. She wasn't performing. She'd paid for her own meals. She'd told me off, gently, for offering too much money too soon. None of the usual patterns fit, and I knew that. And yet, I'd still absorbed some of the contempt. Still let it settle into the way I thought about myself in relation to all of this. I told Mossy next door I'd been in the Philippines looking at retirement options. He said that sounded sensible. I said it had been interesting. That was the full extent of what I told anyone. I booked the second trip for August. 2 weeks. A different guest house this time, slightly closer to La Hague. 1,400 pesos a night. About 23 euros. Still sensible money. Still a man doing reconnaissance. The dynamic with Annalou picked up easily when I arrived. She seemed genuinely pleased I'd come back. It meant something. That she was pleased. We fell back into the restaurant lunches, the easy conversation. I met her parents one evening, briefly, at a family dinner at her sister's house off Kasambagan. Her father was a retired teacher. Small, neat man with a dry manner not entirely unlike my own. Her mother talked constantly and warmly and called me sir until I asked her not to. The family they were just people. Ordinary, warm, a bit overwhelming in number. They didn't treat me like a Kano with a wallet. They treated me like a slightly strange foreign man their daughter knew, which is what I was. A week into the trip, Annalou suggested we take a jeepney up to Tops Lookout. I said yes. We took one of the colored jeepneys from near Crossroads Mall, paid 13 pesos each, about 20 cents, and rode up through the switchbacks into the hills above the city. The jeepney had a stereo playing at a volume that precluded conversation, which was fine. Tops is a viewpoint on a ridge above Cebu. You look out over the whole city, the grid of streets, the reclaimed land running into the strait, the island of Mactan in the haze. We found a bench and sat on it. The air was cooler up there. A rooster was crowing somewhere below us, carrying on some private grievance. There were a handful of other people around, but not many. I sat on that bench, and I was genuinely content. That's the plain fact of it. I was 55 years old, and I was sitting on a bench above a city I didn't know 2 years ago with a woman I found genuinely interesting, and the sun was going down, and the air smelled of something floral I couldn't identify, and I was completely content. More content than I'd been in years, possibly more than I'd been since the mines closed and the shape of things went strange. I said nothing about any of this. We sat there for perhaps 40 minutes. I made some observation about the view. She agreed it was a good view. We watched a group of young people taking photographs of each other on the far side of the lookout. At one point, she said something about Miguel and his chess. Apparently, he'd joined a school club and was winning things, and I said that was good. And that was, more or less, the sum of what was communicated between us during those 40 minutes. She was wondering whether I was bored. I know that now because she told me later. She was sitting on that bench trying to read a man who gave her nothing to read, wondering if he'd rather be somewhere else, wondering if she'd misread the situation entirely, and this was just a foreign man who came to Cebu twice and would stop coming. I was not bored. I was the opposite of bored. It simply had not occurred to me to say so. That's the second thing, and it took me longer to understand it than the first, because at least with the money, I could see how the gesture had gone wrong. With the silence, I genuinely couldn't see the problem. Silence to me was companionable. Silence between two people sitting together had always meant things were settled. Things were comfortable. There was nothing left to prove. That's what it meant underground. That's what it meant in Leitrim. It didn't mean that here. 4 outings that second trip. The lookout, a morning at the Basilica del Santo Niño, where she lit a candle for her husband's anniversary. She mentioned it simply as a fact, and I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. A walk through Colin Street, where she bought something from a pharmacy, a meal at a carinderia near her sister's place, where I ate a pork dish, whose name I forgot immediately, and it was very good. 4 outings, and on not one of them did I say anything that could honestly be described as telling her how I felt about being there. She didn't know where she stood, and I didn't know she didn't know. Both things were true simultaneously for the entire 2 weeks, which is its own particular kind of waste. The last 2 days of the second trip, something was different. Not dramatically different. Not the kind of different you could point at and say, "There, that's the thing." Just a degree of reserve I hadn't felt before. She was still warm. She was still herself. But she was careful in a way she hadn't been in August. And I noticed it the way you notice a change in air pressure underground, before you can explain why you're noticing it. We had coffee on the second to last day. The same place on Salinas Drive. Wooden furniture, the Tagalog pop at a reasonable volume. She had hers black. I had mine wrong, as usual. She was quiet for a bit after we sat down. Not uncomfortable quiet. Thinking quiet. And then she said, quite directly, not unkindly, not with any drama, "Ciarán, I don't know if you are serious or if you are just passing through." I want to try to describe what happened in me when she said that. I think I went very still. Not on the outside. On the outside, I probably just sat there looking at my coffee, which is what I do. But something in me went very still. The way things go still underground when you hear a sound you can't immediately identify, and you wait to understand what it is. She was asking a completely reasonable question. She'd known me for, 5 months by that point. She'd spent time with me. She'd introduced me to her family. She was a perceptive woman, and a practical one, and she needed to know what she was dealing with. It was a completely reasonable question. I didn't have an answer. Not because I didn't have feelings. I did have feelings. I was very fond of her, if I'm being careful with words, which I always am. I thought about her between trips. I looked forward to coming back. The 2 weeks in Cebu had been better than the 4 months between them, and I'd known that while it was happening. I had feelings, but I hadn't examined them properly. Because examining them properly would have required admitting what they were, and admitting what they were would have required admitting what I was doing in Cebu in the first place, which would have required abandoning the version of myself I'd been maintaining. The one who was just doing reconnaissance, just assessing retirement options, just a sensible man making sensible plans. Certainly not a man of 55 who'd flown to the Philippines twice because he was lonely and had met someone who made him feel less so. I'd seen those YouTube comments. I'd absorbed them, and some part of me had decided, quietly and without announcing itself, to keep one foot pointed at the door at all times, so that nobody, including me, could say I'd committed fully to something I ought to be embarrassed about. She could feel the door. She'd been feeling it for months. That's the third thing, and it's the one that took me longest to say out loud. What I told her, after a silence that I'm sure was much longer than was comfortable, was something like, I didn't want to make promises I couldn't keep. That was what I said. It was honest in the technical sense. It was also, in context, completely useless. It told her nothing except that I was a man who didn't know what he wanted, or wouldn't say. She nodded. That was all. Just nodded, once, and looked at her coffee. We finished our drinks. We talked about something else. I don't remember what. Something ordinary. We said goodbye outside on the pavement, where a tricycle was idling nearby, and the smell of someone's lunch from a carinderia across the road drifted over. She said, "Safe travels." I said I'd be in touch. She said yes. And then she walked away. And I stood there for a moment, feeling the particular weight of a conversation that had ended without being finished. I flew home the next morning. The house in Carrick-on-Shannon was dark when I arrived. I turned on the kitchen light. I put the kettle on. I sat down at the kitchen table and I did not turn the television on, which is unusual for me. I generally put it on for the noise, not because I'm watching anything. But that evening, I just sat in the kitchen with the kettle boiling and then not boiling. And I thought about what she'd asked me. The 2 weeks that followed were not dramatic. Ciarán Molloy does not do dramatic. But they were a kind of reckoning, in the slow, deliberate way that reckonings happen to men like me. I went through it carefully, the way you'd inspect a seam you're not sure about. What was I actually doing? What did I actually want? What was I afraid of, specifically? And was that fear doing me any good? The answers were not flattering, but they were clear enough, once I stopped avoiding them. About 10 days after I got home, I rang Aine, my daughter. Actually pressed the call button, not the voice note button. She picked up on the third ring, sounding slightly startled, because I hadn't done that in a long time. We talked for 40 minutes. She told me about her work, about the children, about Melbourne. I told her, and this was unusual for me, that I'd been to the Philippines twice and that there was a woman there I was trying to work out what to do about. Aine was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Dad, why didn't you tell me?" Not as a question, just as a statement. I said I didn't know. She said, "Are you all right?" I said I thought I probably was, but that I'd been going about things wrong, I thought, and I was trying to work out how to go about them right instead. She said, "That sounds like progress." I'm not sure why I rang her. Something had come loose, I think. Some internal arrangement that had been holding things in place had shifted very slightly, enough to let a door open that had been closed for a while. I booked the third trip to Cebu in December, and this time I knew, more or less, why I was going. December in Cebu is different to April or August. The air is still warm, but something has gone out of the heat. It sits at a more reasonable temperature, the kind you can walk around in without negotiating with yourself every 20 minutes. There were Christmas decorations up along Gorordo Avenue when I arrived. Parole lanterns in the windows of the shop houses, the kind shaped like stars, lit from inside. The Philippines takes Christmas seriously, I'd learned. They start in September. By December it's in full swing. And there's something genuinely cheerful about it that I wasn't expecting, coming from a country where Christmas tends to arrive apologetically in the last week of November, and immediately causes arguments about parking. I'd booked 3 weeks this time. Same guest house off Gorordo. Mrs. Ocampo had remembered me, which I found oddly pleasing. Same wobbling ceiling fan. Same room. 1,200 pesos a night. Same as before. Some things you don't change when they're working. I'd spent the 4 months since August doing something I don't normally do, which is examine myself with any real attention. I'm not a man who goes in for that sort of thing, as a rule. Underground, you think about the seam in front of you, the equipment in your hands, the man beside you. You don't think about your inner life, because your inner life is not the thing that will or won't cause the roof to hold. But I'd been going wrong somewhere. Clearly, demonstrably going wrong. And if I couldn't diagnose the fault myself, nobody else was going to do it for me. So I'd gone through it, carefully and without flattering myself. The money thing first. I'd sat with that one and I understood it, finally, in a way I hadn't at the time. The problem wasn't that I was generous. The problem was that I was reaching for generosity as a substitute for something harder, for presence, for words. I'd spent 30 years in a world where a man proved his worth by what he could do and provide and carry. And I'd arrived in Cebu with that same operating manual and tried to apply it to a person who didn't need anything carried. She hadn't needed rescuing. She'd needed me to be there as a person, not as a function. I'd been a function. That was the first thing. The silence was the second. That one I'd turned over for a long time, because it genuinely puzzled me, still puzzles me a bit, honestly, that the way I'd learned to show comfort could read as its exact opposite. Underground, silence between men meant ease. It meant nothing needed saying. I'd sat next to men for 8-hour shifts and exchanged maybe 30 words and gone home feeling we understood each other completely. But I wasn't underground anymore, and Annalou wasn't a collier from Roscommon, and the silence I offered her at Tops Lookout and everywhere else had told her nothing except that she couldn't read me, which she'd eventually decided was perhaps because there was nothing to read. I had to accept that was a reasonable conclusion to draw. The third thing was harder to name even privately. The shame of the wanting. That persistent half-distance I'd kept. The slight irony I'd maintained about my own situation. The way I'd never fully committed to being present because I was afraid of what it would look like. To the YouTube commenters, to Mossy next door, to some imaginary jury of men my age who would look at me and see the cliché I was trying not to be. Annalou had sensed the door I kept one foot pointed toward. Of course she had. She was a perceptive woman. You can't keep that kind of ambivalence hidden from someone who's paying attention. I arrived on a Wednesday. On the Thursday, I messaged Annalou and asked if she wanted to get coffee. She said yes. We met at the place on Salinas Drive the following morning. The same wooden furniture, the same Tagalog pop. I sat down. I didn't build to it. There's no useful way to build to something like this. And preambles make it worse. I looked at the table. Because I'm still myself, eye contact during something like this is not fully available to me. And I said, I'd like to get to know you properly. I'm not passing through. And I'm sorry I made it feel like I might be, because I was afraid of something that turned out to be considerably less important than the thing I was afraid of losing. She was quiet for a moment. She told me later that she'd found this genuinely funny. Not in an unkind way. In the way of a woman who had been waiting for a man to say something real and had received instead a man apologizing earnestly to a piece of furniture. She'd thought, well, at least he means it. You can tell when someone means it, even when they're telling it to a tabletop. She said, okay, Ciarán. Just that. Okay. And then she asked if I wanted to try the new coffee they had, some Bengay single-origin thing the owner was proud of. I said yes. She ordered for both of us in Cebuano, and the tension, such as it was, dispersed. Gradually, like pressure releasing from old ground. The rest of the trip was different. Not transformed, not dramatic. Ciarán Molloy's life does not transform dramatically, but different in the specific way that things are different when two people have finally said the honest thing and can stop working around it. I met her family again, her parents, her sisters, the whole warm, loud, numerous, extended circle. This time I didn't reach for my wallet every time the bill appeared. I paid my share of things and let other people pay theirs. Her mother called me Sir again, until I asked her not to again, and she laughed at me in the fond way of a woman who finds foreigners gently ridiculous, but not unkindly so. Miguel was there one afternoon. 14 years old, chess club, the same polite suspicion I'd noticed in August. Annalou mentioned he played chess, and I said I also played, which was true in the technical sense of knowing where the pieces went. He produced a board with the efficiency of someone accepting a professional obligation and proceeded to beat me in 11 minutes. I had not seen several of the moves coming. He offered a rematch in the manner of someone extending charity to the deserving poor. I accepted. I lost that one in 14 minutes. I'd improved by 3 minutes overall, which I chose to regard as progress. Somewhere in the middle of that third trip, speaking to no one in particular, just the camera and whoever's watching this, I named the 3 things clearly for myself. And I'll name them for you now, not as a list, not as a lecture, just as the plain account of what I'd done wrong and what it had taken me an embarrassingly long time to understand. I'd led with my wallet before I'd led with myself. That's the first one. I'd been present in body and absent in voice. I'd communicated contentment by sitting silently and expected that to be legible. It wasn't. That's the second. And I'd been ashamed of wanting what I wanted, which meant I'd kept myself at half distance for months, and a perceptive woman had sensed the door I kept 1 foot pointed toward and had reasonably assumed I might use it. That's the third. None of these are Filipino problems. None of these are problems specific to men of a certain age or a certain background. They're just the particular shape of the damage I'd accumulated. From 30 years underground, from a Catholic county that didn't discuss feelings, from a culture of male silence that meant well but traveled badly. I brought my old shape to a new place and expected it to fit. It didn't, and the Philippines, unlike a great many places, was kind enough to show me that clearly enough that I could do something about it. That was December 2023. It's now early 2025. 14 months, give or take. Annalou and I are, well, going reasonably well, all things considered. That's the most accurate description I have. We're not rushing. Neither of us has the temperament for rushing, which is probably one of the reasons this has worked as well as it has. She's still in Cebu. I'm still in Carrick-on-Shannon for the time being. I've been back twice since December. 3 weeks each time, tourist visa, which gives you 30 days extendable at the Bureau of Immigration for a modest fee. I've looked into the longer options, the SRRV retirement visa and so on, but the deposit requirement starts at $10,000, and I'm not at the stage of committing that kind of money to a bureaucratic arrangement I'm still learning. There's no hurry. The pension comes in every month. The house in Carrick isn't going anywhere. What I want to tell you, if you're watching this and you recognize yourself in any part of what one have described, is what it actually looks like when it's working. Because I've watched a fair few videos on this channel and elsewhere, and they're usually about what goes wrong. This one is, technically, about what nearly went wrong. But I want to be specific about what right looks like from the inside because I think it's useful. Annalou works. She continues to work. She does the books for Rodel's restaurant and 2 other small businesses in the Lahug area, and she has no intention of stopping because a foreign man has arrived in her life. She pays for her own meals more often than not. When we go somewhere together, she sometimes pays, and sometimes I do, and sometimes we split it. And none of these arrangements are declarations of anything. They're just practical. I have not given her money for her family's expenses. I have not offered to fund improvements to her parents' house, which is a modest place in a barangay just north of Mandaue. Her parents have managed without my assistance for their entire lives, and will presumably continue to do so. This isn't coldness on my part, it's respect, which took me an embarrassingly long time to understand, is the thing she was asking for from the start. Miguel has beaten me at chess 14 times. I have not won once. I've accepted this as the likely permanent shape of our relationship, which seems to suit both of us. He is now 15 and marginally less suspicious of me, which I take as progress. He told me, on the last visit, that my opening was predictable. I said I was aware of that. He nodded in the manner of a boy who finds adults endearingly limited, but tolerates them anyway. I find this acceptable. I ring Ine every 2 weeks now. Actually ring. We've had more real conversations in the past year than in the previous 5 combined. I'm not entirely sure how to account for this, except that something opened up in me when I admitted to her what I was doing. And once it was open, it was easier to keep open. She came to Carrick for a week at Christmas with her family. The grandchildren, who are aged 7 and 4 and have opinions about everything. It was considerably louder than I'm used to. I found I didn't mind. Now, if you're a man watching this who recognizes himself in any of what I've described, and I suspect some of you do, or you wouldn't still be here, let me say the 3 things plainly, because that's what this was always meant to be about. The first one is the money. If you go somewhere new, and the first thing you reach for is your wallet, you need to ask yourself what you're actually doing. Generosity is not a personality. It's not a relationship. It can feel like both of those things when you're lonely enough, because it gives you a role and a function and a reason to be present, and you mistake the feeling of being useful for the feeling of being wanted. They're not the same feeling. A woman with any dignity will feel the difference immediately, even if she can't name it straight away. Lead with yourself. The money can come later, in the ordinary way that it comes in any ordinary relationship, when it makes sense, not when it's doing the work of introduction. The second one is the silence. This one I give you with particular feeling, because it took me genuinely by surprise. Where I come from, silence between people who are comfortable together is its own form of communication. It means nothing needs saying. But that's a language that doesn't travel, and if you assume it will, you will spend months being a mystery to someone who deserves better than a mystery. You have to say the thing. Not constantly, not effusively. Just occasionally, when it's true, tell the person beside you what you're actually experiencing. I was content. I should have said I was content. That's all it needed. I didn't say it, and she sat there for 40 minutes, wondering if I wanted to be somewhere else. Don't do that. And the third one, the shame. This is the one underneath the other 2, and if I'm honest, it's the one that nearly sank everything. I was embarrassed about wanting what I wanted. I'd absorbed the contempt of people on the internet, people who'd never met me, never met Annalou, never sat in Rodell's restaurant eating sinigang and talking about nothing in particular, and I'd let it make me keep 1 foot pointed at the door for months. The half-distance, the ironic positioning, the persistent implication that I wasn't fully committed to being there, that I was just passing through. She could feel it. Of course she could. If you carry shame about what you're doing, the person you're doing it with will feel the shame too, and they'll draw the only reasonable conclusion available to them, which is that you don't think much of them either. You're not a cliché if you're honest about what you're looking for. You're only a cliché if you pretend otherwise and waste everybody's time. That's Ciarán Molloy, 55 years old, County Leitrim, Ireland, formerly of the Arigna Mines and the Tyrone coal field, currently of a guest house off Gorordo Avenue, a carinderia where the sinigang is very good, and something careful and real that he very nearly managed to destroy before he'd even properly started it. Better late, he'll tell you, looking somewhere in the vicinity of the table. Better late. That's where we leave Ciarán today. Not at rock bottom, and not riding off into a perfect sunset either. Just somewhere in the middle, which is where most genuine things live. Doing the work, showing up more honestly than he did before, building something modest and real with someone who asked, from the very beginning, only to be treated as a person rather than a problem to be solved. Here at Inside the Philippines, we tell a lot of stories that end in financial loss or heartbreak, or legal nightmares that cost men years and savings they'll never fully recover. Those stories are important, and we'll keep telling them because the warnings in them are real and people need to hear them. But Ciarán's story carries warnings too. They're just quieter ones. The men who get hurt in the Philippines aren't always hurt by scammers. Sometimes they're hurt by the version of themselves they brought along, the assumptions they didn't know they were making, the emotional vocabulary they never developed because the place they came from didn't require it, the shame they carried that kept them at arm's length from the thing they'd actually come looking for. His 3 reasons aren't Filipino problems. They're not even expat problems specifically. They're human problems that become very visible very quickly when you step outside the context that's always made them invisible. So wherever you are watching this, whether you're planning your first trip, or you're already out here, or you've already come home with complicated feelings about something that didn't quite work the way you hoped, ask yourself which of those 3 things you recognize: the wallet, the silence, the shame, and whether it might be worth working on that before you ask someone else to work around it. That's all from us today on Inside the Philippines. If Ciarán's story landed for you, leave us a comment. We genuinely read them, and so will he. Subscribe if you haven't, because there are more stories to come, including some considerably more disastrous ones that will make Ciarán's look like a very manageable Tuesday. And we'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves out there.